Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi everyone, welcome back again to As I Live and Grieve. So glad you took the time out of your busy day. Maybe you're in the car, maybe you're dropping the kids off at school, or you're taking yourself to or from work, but we appreciate you dropping in. Have a great guest today. I know I say that every week, but it's true, isn't it? Our guests are amazing. Today with me is Michelle Collins. We're going to talk a little bit about suicide, specifically suicide, the loss of a partner or spouse. Hi, Michelle. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Before we get started on our topic, which is critical and so important to me for so many reasons, would you just give our listeners a little bit of your background, please?
Sure. Yeah, I am a yoga therapist and a grief and wellness coach. I did a grief education certification, if you can believe there's a certification in that, a couple of years ago, and an author. Have some books out and new ones coming soon. And I help people by coaching or practicing yoga therapy, teaching mindfulness or meditation to get through difficult things that could be grief, it could be trauma, it could be a disease, newly diagnosed illnesses and accidents, injuries. And I just help people learn how to greet the world with mindfulness practices that lessen suffering, or at least the intent is to lessen suffering.
Yeah, and we all know that that's so hard to do. It's so easy to kind of get stuck in your grief. And I heard something great on the Today Show today, actually, Mel Robbins.
Oh, I love her.
It was just a little teaser of a podcast she's doing with Hoya Kotb. And she talked about the word stuck. And she said, it's not a position. It's really just a signal to let you know that you're probably ready for something else, that you're not growing where you are and you're ready for something else. And I thought that was great perspective.
Yeah, I like that, because it kind of means you're not stuck. You're just aware that it's time to move to the next
Exactly.
thing.
Yeah. So when you talk about mindfulness, and we all know, I remember myself a point in my grief that I just really said to myself, because there was no one else around except a dog. But I said, I can't go on like this anymore. I don't want to go on like this anymore. This is not how I want to spend the rest of my life. And something clicked in me at that moment. And I knew that if I didn't want to go on that way, I was the one that had to do something about it.
Yeah.
No one else, nothing else was going to bring it to my door. I had to get up, get moving, and do what I needed. Now, today we're going to talk about suicide. I have the utmost respect when someone can bring their personal story and share that. Could you share a little bit of your experience with suicide?
Yeah, I can. And it's interesting because when I get asked a question, it's usually much more specific to my personal. I lost my husband to suicide, but I also realized that I have friends that I've known over the years who have died by suicide as well. So it's not just that one experience, although losing a spouse is certainly earth-shattering no matter how you lose them.
Right.
Glenn was my second husband. I met him a year after I was divorced from my first husband, and he and I just fell madly in love. Like, it was one of those, it seemed like a fairy tale. Like, is this real? I had so much trouble believing that it was real because, we were in our late 40s at the time. So you don't think of that kind of love happening, think of it as something that happens
Yeah.
as your teens or your 20s or whatever, but it was just so real and so perfect. And we
Mm-hmm.
just met at, we'd both been divorced about a year and a half. And we ended up getting married just 90 days after we met because
Mm.
we were so sure that we were the answer to all of
Right.
our missing pieces. And then less than 2 years later, he died by suicide. He had been struggling, obviously, and we just could not get him out of the spiral that he was
Right.
in, struggling, and he ended up dying.
I'm so, so sad to hear that. It's you're absolutely right that losing a spouse. I know I lost my husband to brain cancer. It was a very aggressive form of cancer. Nothing we could do to prevent it, delay it, or anything. It's the hardest thing I've ever gone through. But to suffer a loss like that through a traumatic instance, especially suicide, is unimaginable to me. Unimaginable. Now, you have written two books, and they're coming out very, very soon, as I
Mm-hmm.
understand it, near the end of the month. And one is to help people move through the loss of a partner or spouse. The other one, which I was tickled to see, is a book for people who know someone who is going through that loss and how you can support them. Was that idea for the second book part of your experience having others who have committed suicide? How did you get the idea for that accompanying book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So much happens after a suicide loss that is not supportive of your healing because people around you, and the way I talk about it in the book is as if a tornado came through your neighborhood and it might have completely wiped out your house. Like your house is
Hmm.
completely gone, but your neighbors also had a lot of damage. And those are the
Right,
people that are supposed to be supporting you, right? Your
right,
in-law family, your friends, whoever it is that also knew your partner or spouse. And what happens is when people are not at their best when they are traumatized by a suicide of someone that they
right,
loved or even someone they knew, um, even casually. It really causes a ripple effect, more like a tidal wave that makes it hard for anyone to support anyone. And
hmm,
it's easier to blame than take responsibility. It's easier to look outward and try to keep it out, pointed outward than it is to be inward. And so if you can't feel responsible for your own emotions, I'm not saying you're responsible for
right,
the death, but for
right,
the fact
right,
that you're just completely upset, um, then things with a suicide loss that are different than a different kind of death, the in-law family can blame the spouse. And I've heard this a number of times
yeah,
in the grief groups that I moderate. The coworkers can have one idea of what happened and the family can have another idea and the friends can have another idea, whereas if it's a car accident, which is also sudden and horrifying,
hmm,
no one's no one's really putting the same kind of blame that comes with suicide. I mean, you might be able to have guilt. Oh, I shouldn't have told him to go to the store or something like that. But
sure, sure,
yeah, so it's a whole different world. So you back to your question. Sorry, I got
hmm,
I got
that's
off on
okay,
it. Um,
that's okay,
the reason I wrote that book is because so many people don't know what to do to support someone in grief,
hmm,
and especially with a suicide loss, you say the
right,
wrong things, and whenever someone says the wrong thing, they're trying to help the suicide loss survivor, but what they end up doing is causing more suffering.
sure,
And so I wanted to educate the supporters. So hopefully someone will pick up that book whose friend lost their spouse to suicide, and they'll
hmm,
have basically a plan of action, what to
hmm.
do, and some pretty good tips what not to do as well.
Yeah. Well, I know I'm going to have a copy of that book because I have a dear friend who lost her adult son to suicide. And
So
even
sorry.
though I have some experience, if you will, and have talked to many, many, many people about grief and little things you can do here and there to support, to help, to aid, to reduce the pain of the symptoms of grief, I'm still at a loss because it's so hard to know what to do. So I'm going to be getting a copy of that book as soon as it comes out.
Thank you. Thanks for your support and your support of your friend.
Oh,
It's really, really hard. And
yeah,
I say that in my
yeah.
books. Suicide loss is a really hard thing to be strong around. It's
It
frightening.
is. It is, and I think there's probably a lot of judgment that enters
Mhm.
into the grief for a lot of people, which just isn't fair. And all of your comments made me think of the recent death of Twitch,
Mhm.
who just had so many people reeling
Mhm.
over how it just caught everyone off guard and you never would have thought, and everything in the comments that are out there in social media and everything. And even though that's somebody that we may not have known personally, he brought a lot of joy and a lot of smiles, especially during the pandemic with
Mhm.
his family's dances and everything. So people still feel that, and the fact that it was a death by suicide makes it harder to know, what do we do with this grief now? How do we get through it? Can you think of anything based on your experience now that if you were to meet someone or be introduced to someone who recently lost their partner, death by suicide, what might you say to them? Can you give us an idea of what you might say to comfort them?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And just to commiserate about Twitch, one of the things that really brought me a lot of joy during started watching them during the pandemic as well, he and
Right.
Allison and the kids. And yeah, that really that
Yeah.
I had a couple days of mourning. And
Yeah.
this is ties into the answer to your question, and that is, allow yourself to grieve. A lot of us
Hmm.
think, oh, well, my physical body's still working. I can go back to work. I can keep
Right.
whatever, taking care of the kids, whatever it is that your daily routine requires. And um, the thing is, you've been injured. Even if you
Right.
don't feel physically injured, your physical and emotional are not separate in my belief system. And
Right.
so it will come out at some way, at some time. It might be in weeks or months, but you'll find yourself
Hmm.
exhausted, or you'll find, something will be really, really difficult that didn't used to be.
Right.
So my best advice is just let yourself grieve. If you broke your
Hmm.
leg, you wouldn't go hiking the next day. You
Mm-mm.
need that time to heal. Bones take 6 weeks. Emotions take, it's undetermined. There's so
Yeah.
many other factors, but um, they just added a new diagnosis, formal diagnosis, that uh, long grief is over 12 months, and
Hmm.
grief experts are saying that's just not appropriate.
It's
Grief
not.
is because sometimes you don't start grieving right away if you
That's
don't
right.
allow yourself to, and then you find yourself, years down the road,
Hmm.
okay, I'm ready to start feeling these feelings, and
Yeah.
then you grieve, and that's okay. There's no wrong way to do it. So I guess
Right.
that would be the biggest piece of advice I would give, is there's no wrong way to do it, but you do need to do it at some point.
Right.
You need to accept that your loved one's gone
Hmm.
and create your new life. Because I think, and you probably experienced this, after, at some point when you decided it was time to have a life, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't dishonor the memory of your loved one to live
No.
a full life. In fact, I think it's an honoring of your loved one's memory, uh,
Right.
to grieve. David Kessler always says, in order to live fully, you need to grieve fully.
Right. Right.
And more practical pieces of advice would be get a village. All those people in that first week that
Mm-hmm.
said, "What can I do? How can I help?" Keep a list of them and go back months, a year later. They
Mm-hmm.
still need to be told what to do. So go, when you need the help, ask for it and let them help you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really hard for a lot of people to ask for that help. It's so easy
Mhm.
to tend to isolate yourself and not ask anybody for anything. And we often say, I just want to be left alone, when that's really the last thing that would help us is to be alone.
Yeah, our grief needs to be witnessed. That's one of the
Definitely.
first thing that needs to happen is you need to be witnessed. People need to
Definitely.
know you're
Definitely.
grieving. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a quote, and I reference it so many times in this podcast, but it was the one that was a revelation for me. And at the end of the quote, it just says that grief is love with no place to go.
Oh.
And when I heard that, it was a light bulb clicked on. And I said, that's it exactly. I still have love for my husband, but he's not here for
Mhm.
me to share it with him. And that was about the same time that I had this other revelation about I don't want to go on like this anymore. It was mind altering for me to absorb those words and then at the same time know that I'm probably going to grieve my husband for the rest of my life. So I agree with you that that definition of 12 months, that's ridiculous.
Mm.
Absolutely ridiculous. I am just now really kind of grieving with the loss of my infant son that was decades ago,
Mhm.
that because there was no help and nobody knew anything about grief, I was told to pretty much suck it up and move on. And that's what I did. That's what I did. 3 days later, I went out, looking for a job to move on. And it's been through these podcasts and the discussions that that grief is coming back. And it's just like it's brand new. It's
Mhm.
just like the loss of that infant boy happened months ago.
Because you didn't allow yourself to grieve at the
I
time.
didn't. I didn't. Yeah. So I don't like that diagnosis at all.
I
And
agree.
I'm sure the therapists don't like it either because I'm sure it's and I would doubt I would be really surprised if any clinicians actually use it, to tell you the truth, because I wouldn't want my license listing that. At any rate, I digress. So when we talk about time and length and everything like that, there are things certainly that need to be taken care of immediately. Funeral, calling hours, memorial service, and then paperwork. And if listeners have not gone through that overwhelming pile of paperwork, phone calls that need to be made, and everything after you lose your partner, your spouse, then there's no way I can even put that in words. It takes days and days and days. Do you have any tips for people on how to kind of get through that and still take care of yourself in the meantime?
I do. I do. There's very few things that need to be done immediately. And that's you kind of feel like, "Oh, I have to do everything all at once." And so there's all this pressure. And there's a few things that need to be done, right away, like what you just listed. That was a great list.
Right,
And I actually list this off in my books. Get the death certificates and all
right.
the things about the accounts that are in both your names if you were, sharing
Hmm.
accounts, married or not. People who are
Right.
not necessarily legally married may share a home. They both are
Sure.
homeowners or whatever. So
Or a bank
all of
account.
the bank account for sure. So all of those things, but there's no urgency to anything other than the bills. And most of the time, you can call and they will give you an allowance, to pay a
Hmm.
smaller amount if you have a large payment, or even put it off altogether until you get the estate settled. And, as a widow, after any type of a big loss, it takes so much energy just to do the basic things like make coffee or get
Right.
out of bed. So don't expect to be able to do 10 hours of work on this paperwork and run 20 errands. Just do maybe one thing a day and get help. That's the other thing too. Get help. People don't mind making phone calls for you because it gives them something to do. And a lot of
Right.
these phone calls you have to make yourself, and you have to get the death certificate out. I had a very good friend who I couldn't even look at Glenn's death certificate because there's a long form and a short form, and the long form death
Sure.
certificate was required by some of the organizations that were part of the estate, and I couldn't even look at it without just
Yeah.
because it said the cause of death. I didn't want to
Absolutely.
read it, and so I had just an angel of a friend and we were faxing things because these were government agencies. He worked for the government when he died, and he was retired military. So there were a lot of faxing things. And so she
Right.
actually took a copy of the death certificate to work, and I would just send her, this is where it needs to be faxed. Here's the cover letter. And that saved me so many hours of just sobbing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Can you think of anything you can tell someone? How do I want to word it? Maybe like a mantra, a phrase, an affirmation, something that you can have in your head and repeat over and over again to keep yourself going, to keep yourself in that mindfulness state where you need to be to practice self-care. Can you
Yeah,
I'm struggling
absolutely.
to find the words, but I
No,
think you know what I'm trying
I
to
do.
ask.
I totally get your question. And not only that, it's making me laugh because I feel like you've already read my books that are coming
Oh,
out January because
no,
it, you're asking the questions like almost by the chapter. It's so funny.
that's amazing. That's
Yeah. So
amazing.
that makes me feel really good because I know that
Wow.
it's what people need, which is why I wrote
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
So as far as affirmations go and mantras, I think having a few of them on hand depending on what you
Mhm.
need. The one I used a lot was "You got this," and I'm not saying you got this like you're going to go back into your life and it's going to be joyful. I mean, okay, you can put on a sock,
Mhm.
you got this.
Right.
You can
Right.
choose pants, you got this. And then a reassurance that I often use now with clients. I didn't have this back then, but you won't always feel the way you do now. Because sometimes when you are deep in the throes of grief, you cannot see any light. You think you will always feel just as horrible as you do today, and it's never going to end
Mhm.
and it's never going to change. And that's just not possible. Every tick of the clock, things change. I'm not saying time heals all wounds. Like
Mhm.
you were describing before, you're like, okay, I can't go on like this. I have to make a change. So some of
Mhm.
healing does have to come from internal power, internal motivation. But one thing I can guarantee to anyone out there listening, you will not always feel the way you do right now.
I like that. I think I would have to write that and put it on my bathroom mirror or something.
That's another thing I
That's
say in my book. Are you sure you didn't get an
I
advance copy?
honest.
It was
I would,
amazing.
there will be copies on my bookshelf, but I have not read it. Um, but those are all things that I think I eventually looked for, or if I didn't have them to help me through discussion with other guests and everything for the podcast, all things that I've realized can be of aid because, again, it's so easy to do nothing. And I don't say that in a trifling manner. It's easy to just sit and not move. It takes courage. It takes strength. It takes an incredible amount of motivation to get yourself moving after suffering a loss. And loss by suicide is one of those that just magnifies the complexities of it, just magnify the intensity of that grief. You're filled with guilt. You may feel what others are saying to you is in the form of judgment. Some may be outright judgmental. I mean, some may not be so kind. That the devastation is incredible. So it's easy to sit and do nothing. Don't take the easy route. And I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah.
But if you don't have somebody trying to help you with that, it's even more difficult.
It is. And when helpers don't know what to do.
Right.
Which is why I wrote the book for helpers. Yeah.
Right.
To try to help people, just to educate people. This is a good thing to
Yeah.
say to someone who lost their spouse or
Yeah.
partner to suicide, and this is a
Right.
not good thing.
Yeah.
Don't say that. Don't do that.
Exactly. And I think in our desperation sometimes to say something, because we're so uncomfortable with silence, aren't we? So uncomfortable with it that
Yep.
what works for me many times when I have to go to calling hours or a funeral, and you give that hug and everything, the only thing I can think to say is I have no words.
Right. And that's
Because
okay, because you leave
that it
space
lets
in
them
that
know that
comment
you are
for the grief.
exactly,
Yep.
you are also incredibly upset and saddened by what has happened, that you might like to offer them something, but you have no words. Just take that, even if it sounds like a cop out, it's really not, because you're still conveying to them that you're there for them.
Yeah. Or you can say, I'm here. Just, I'm here.
Right.
I'm
I'm
here.
here. Exactly. Yeah. But please don't say to them, let me know if you need anything. For one thing, at that moment, they have no idea what they might need.
So
And
true.
and the second thing is, it may not be quite sincere. That is offered so many times as an empty gesture that sometimes when you're really, really, really hurting, it sounds like such a trivial thing to say. And it isn't taken with that gratitude that is really what we want to convey. Sometimes don't say anything. Just give them that hug and
Yeah.
move on.
Yeah.
Something like that. This is an opinion question. This is not a critical question. But in mentioning, for example, that long grief is 12 months, do you feel that grief is a mental health diagnosis or a mental health condition?
I do not. I do not. I feel like grief is a normal human process that we go through when we lose something, just like healing a broken bone.
Uh-huh.
It's just our society, our culture isn't educated in grief, which is part of the reason I took that grief educator course, certification course. We don't know what to do, and we expect people to
Mm-hmm.
go back to their old lives in a
Mm-hmm.
relatively short time. So no, I think it's like, it would be like saying sadness is a mental illness. It's
Right.
not. Grieving is a process we need to go through when we suffer a
Mm-hmm.
loss in order to heal and live fully again. And whether that takes, a month. I mean, like I said about Twitch last week, I wrote a
Mm-hmm.
blog about that. I did some social media posts. And I spent a couple days actually grieving, and I never knew Twitch in person, but his
Right.
existence brought me so much joy. Uh,
Right.
and I grieved, but I recognized it as grief. I knew I was grieving. I
Mm-hmm.
knew I had to take a couple days and do extra self-care, extra rest, because I was sad. And I needed
Yeah.
to let that sadness go through me and process it
Right.
and allow it. and and it's the
Yeah.
same with grief. I think that when it becomes an illness is when you get to the point where your loss ends your life too. If you cannot function at a basic level, getting out of bed, eating, taking a shower once in a while, maybe a year or two later, then it's time to look into, is this depression? Is this
Right.
something else? And I say a year or two because I'm not going to start stepping into the when is it okay?
No.
It could be months, it could be years, but and it can also be a sneaky thing, like what you were saying about your son. And
Yeah.
I'm so sorry for your loss, by
Yeah.
the way. You might get up and run and be in your life, and then 10 years later finally be to a point where you can start touching into
Right.
those feelings and then
Yeah.
start grieving. So
Yeah.
that's not mental illness, not at all.
No. 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 I like the way you phrased it. I like the things you said about it. I agree with that. That's my opinion also. I do feel that some of the symptoms of grief, if not managed, or if you don't allow yourself that time to heal and move toward healing, that some of those symptoms can definitely be some mental health issues. But
Yeah, our brains can rewire to focus on the negative, the sad,
right,
and
right,
it can become a much bigger part of your life.
right.
And that can be hard to you know change the direction of that, but
hmm
you can.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, sadly, our time is winding down. So this is the part in the podcast where I turn the microphone over to you and let you speak directly to our listeners. And I will not interrupt with any questions. So this is your time solely to speak directly to them. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, and you're welcome to interrupt. So I have two books that will be launching, released by Saved by Story Publishing House. Surviving Spouse or Partner Suicide Loss, a mindful guide for your journey through grief, and Supporting a Survivor of Spouse or Partner Suicide Loss, a mindful guide for co-journeying through grief. And those two books came from my experiences and my education after losing my husband Glenn to suicide in 2016. They're coming out January 26th of 2023. And I would love you to read them, share them, if there's anyone you know that needs that type of support. I am also a grief and wellness coach, and if you ever need to investigate my services, I give free consultations, and also there's a free transition anxiety awareness kit or toolkit on my website, which is inhabitjoy.com. So if you want to find me anywhere, inhabitjoy.com has all my socials, and I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. And yeah, and I teach yoga classes. I do private yoga therapy, all in service of helping people build resilience, because I do not believe life is easy. I believe that even if we aren't in grief or having a difficult physical challenge right now, we should be in shape for when it comes, because life
Because
throws us curveballs, and that's what
that's just the way life is.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I try to
Yeah.
teach habits and practices that help us improve our ability to navigate difficult times.
That's great. Are your books available for pre-order?
They are not, but
Not.
you can
Okay.
sign up. There's on my publisher's website, Saved by Story.
Okay.
There is a place to sign up for pre-order.
Okay.
You
Okay.
can't actually pay for it ahead of time, but
But they'll remind you when it's ready and released.
yes.
Super.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
That's a great question.
I will be heading there shortly to get a copy of both of them.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you so much again for taking the time out of your day, for speaking so candidly and sincerely about this, which I can only describe as a very intimate detail of your life.
Thank
It's
you.
not
Yeah.
easy, I'm sure, to talk about it, but your motivation for doing so is genuine and sincere. And I'm sure that there are listeners out there that have also been touched by it today. And whether it's an experience that they themselves have gone through, are going through, or whether they know someone, there are little tidbits in this entire podcast, Michelle, that are so excellent that will help people, and I know they'll take it to heart. For our listeners, I want to remind you all about self-care. We do this every time, every episode. Self-care is critical when you're grieving. Even the tiniest thing, whether it might be get a pedicure for yourself or get up and take that shower. It doesn't matter what it is, but do something special for yourself today. You're certainly worthy of it and you deserve it. Michelle's information as far as her contact info will be on our episode notes. They'll be on our website as well. And we hope you join us again next week. Again, take care as we all continue to live and grieve.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveandgrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.